Welcome everybody. My name is Bronwyn Strong and I'd like to welcome you to the Archaeology meeting of the Natural History Society of Maryland. Tonight, we are so lucky and honored to have with us Rebecca Morehouse. And she's the curator of the Maryland Archaeological Collections. Is that correct? Go down at the lab, the MAC lab in Southern Maryland. And we can't travel there physically, but she's going to take us on a tour of the facility in a virtual manner this evening and whet our appetite so that when after the pandemic is completely over and everything is safe, we can all go down there and play with her toys. Thank you, Rebecca or Becky, if you'd like to go by. We're so glad that you're here to share with us about the MAC Lab.
Okay, well, thanks for inviting me. Let me just share my screen here. I'm not as familiar with Zoom as I am with Google Meets because technically as a state employee, I'm not supposed to use Zoom. But let me see if this works. And can you all see that? Okay, great.
Yep.
Just wanted to make sure I didn't have my notes page up. I have the actual presentation up. So this is probably only going to be about 30 minutes. So, hopefully there'll be time for questions if y'all have any. A regular tour of the lab, if it's in person, is usually at least an hour, but that's like walking around and that's, you can kind of have an organic conversation and people can ask questions as you go through. So this is just going to kind of be a quick overview to kind of give, especially the folks who have never been to the MAC Lab before, which I'm going to assume most people who are at this meeting tonight haven't. I recognize some names. I see that, Nancy Giese and obviously Ilka has been to the lab before, but for those of you who haven't, this is going to be a tour as if you've never been there, and I hope that as Bronwyn said, that this will kind of give you whet your appetite for when we're all allowed to interact again and actually be social with each other again. So I will get started. So the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Lab is an archaeological research, conservation, and curation facility which is located in Southern Maryland at Jefferson, Patterson Park and Museum, which I'll refer to as JPPM, just like I'll refer to the lab as the MAC Lab. The JPPM was established in 1983 when Mary Marvin Breckenridge Patterson, who's pictured here in that black and white photo, donated over 500 acres of land along the Patuxent River to the Maryland Historical Trust. This donation was the largest land gift, and I think it's still the largest gift of land that's ever been given to the state. And during the signing ceremony, that transferred the land to the state, Mrs. Patterson specifically said, greatest gift that is in my power to the gift of land is the greatest gift that is in my power to give, and I give it willingly to the state of Maryland because of the archaeology. So this 500 plus acres, we're up I think to like 570 plus acres now, is we consider it an archaeological preserve, and we call ourselves, Jeff Pat also calls itself the State Museum of Archaeology. So we don't just have the MAC Lab, the whole park is considered an archaeological preserve. When MHT was first thinking about building an archaeological repository, this was like back in the 70s. They really wanted to build a repository for the archaeological collections. But at that time, there really wasn't anywhere that they thought would be a good place for it. But once Mrs. Patterson made this donation, and because specifically she was donating it because of the archaeological sites that had been recorded on this piece of property, and it was being donated to the Maryland Historical Trust, it seemed like it was the perfect location for the MAC Lab. So by the mid 80s is when they started really planning the Mac Lab, designing the Mac Lab, and that began in earnest in the 1980s. And so after over about a decade of planning, the state finally opened the Mac Lab in the late 1990s, in 1998. So the Mac Lab serves as the repository for the archaeological collections from terrestrial and underwater archaeological excavations from throughout Maryland. We don't hold all of the archaeological collections from Maryland. There are some institutions within the state that hold their own collections, like Historic St. Mary's City and Anne Arundel County, the Lost Towns Project, they hold their own collections. But the vast majority of the archaeological work that's done in the state, any collections that are generated, end up at the Mac Lab. So the lab is unique in that it is one of the few facilities in the country that incorporates an archaeological research mission along with a conservation lab and a curation facility. So that's why we consider ourselves pretty special. So the lab is divided into public and secure spaces. So the public area, which is in the front of the building here, where we have a meeting room that can be rented out, which community organizations can rent out for use. And there's also a library, a research library. And the library holds one of the region's largest reference collections on archaeology and history in Maryland and the Mid-Atlantic area. It has over 14,000 references dealing with such topics as Native American life, the identification and conservation of artifacts, agricultural history, historic buildings, museum studies, archaeology from around the world. And although it's non-lending, the catalog is it can be accessed on the JPPM website, and it is open to the public, so we encourage people to come in and use the references in-house. The public area also houses the staff kitchen and lounge because we try not to have any food back in the secure areas where the collections are. We don't want to introduce anything that might attract pests such as mice and insects that could damage the collection. So we try to keep all of our food down in this area here. So the secure area of the building, which is the main area that we're going to be touring this evening, includes 3 wings, which is the research wing, which is right here, and then the conservation wing, and then the curation wing, which is curation storage, is back here. So our first stop on the virtual tour will be the Archaeological Range. So this is what we call this is the main archaeology lab, but it's called the Range is the word that we use for it. So it just sort of gives you an overview. This is the space where the lab's archaeologists process, catalog, and analyze artifacts. And the size and the layout of the range allows for several projects to be worked on at one time, which is really important, because I'm assuming, since this is the archaeology club, that we all understand, that when you're excavating, that you don't want to mix up where artifacts are coming out of the ground. What we call the provenience. You want to keep collections separate that are being worked on, or artifacts that are from different projects. You want to make sure nothing gets mixed up. So it's great that the lab was designed with such a nice large lab space that has room with several tables for folks to work on many projects at once. The range is also where we store our artifact type collections. So these type collections contain some of the most significant types of datable artifacts recovered from archaeological sites in Maryland. And these are also the artifacts that are found on the Diagnostic Artifacts in Maryland website, which some of you may be aware of. I'll talk a little bit more about it in the next slide. The purpose of these collections, as well as the accompanying website, is to assist archaeologists and anyone else with an interest in Maryland archaeology to recognize objects typically found within Maryland and to become familiar with the descriptive terms that are commonly used in this area. But many of the artifacts have a broader geographical range than just Maryland, so it's used by a much wider audience, and we know it's even used internationally. So the Diagnostic Artifacts webpage was started about 20 years ago, where we just focused initially on Native American and colonial European ceramics that can be found in Maryland. But since then, the page has had significant updates, starting with Postcolonial Ceramics, when Patricia Sanford became the Mac Lab director about 14 years ago, and I'm pretty sure she's at this somewhere here at this talk. So if she's still here when we're done, if there's questions I can't answer, I'm going to call on her. But the post-colonial ceramics was one of Tricia's is one of her areas of expertise. So when she was hired to be director, it was like that was one of the first things we really wanted, was to update the Diagnostic Artifacts webpage with post-colonial ceramics, because colonial ceramics are actually, compared to post-colonial, are fairly straightforward. Post-colonial ceramics are really complicated. So it was really, that was one of the best things that she did when she first started. So, but then since then, she's also added table glass, bottle seals, bone toothbrushes, and toys. And then our other curator, our federal curator, Sarah Rivers Cofield, has added several types of what we call small finds. And those are usually, these sort of unique objects, small objects that, they're found in small quantities on sites, but they can really help date a site. And so Sarah has added things like leather ornaments that are associated with horse tack, bridle bosses, religious artifacts, and cufflinks. And Sarah also just received a grant from the Conservation Fund to research additional horse-related artifacts and add them to the Diagnostic webpage. So she's going to be adding bits and horseshoes, saddle parts, and artifacts that are associated with horse care, like curry combs and mane scissors. Those are going to be some of the next types of artifacts that are going to be updated on the website. And so I also want to talk about a few just quickly, and then we'll start looking at some groovy artifacts. But I want to talk briefly about some of the other online resources we have that the Mac Lab has produced over the years. The research program in particular has created a number of collections-based resources that for use by researchers. And so one of the first was the Archaeological Collections in Maryland. It was one of the first efforts by the lab, and it was to increase the accessibility of the collections. We wanted to let people know what we had. It was a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we put approximately 35 of our most important collections up online. So first we organized them, cataloged them, conserved the artifacts that needed to be conserved. Then we created finding aids that include site descriptions, maps, scanned field records, and artifact images. And then again, once Tricia came on as director, she wanted to sort of expand on that. So she created something that was called Maryland Unearthed, and this was funded by the Maryland State Highway Administration. We got a grant from some funding from SHA, and this part of the website prioritizes collections that are generated by what we call Phase 2 and Phase 3 excavations. So these are more sites that have had more extensive excavation and therefore have, in theory, have generated more artifacts and maybe found more archaeological features. So this particular section of the website really focuses on describing all the individual features at a site. When we say feature, it's they're sort of the things that you really can't take out of the ground. It's things like post holes, and they're not artifacts, but they still tell you a lot about the site. So they're things like post holes and cellars and privies and that kind of thing. So this part of the website focuses on inventorying all of those features across all of these sites that have gone to Phase 2s and Phase 3s. And you can search this particular part of the website by site or by map, on a map, or also on keywords. So it's just another way to make available the the information about the collections that we have at the lab. And then we also have a monthly Curator's Choice, which is a series that highlights significant and unusual artifacts that are chosen from the Mac Lab collections, written by Mac staff. And then there's also Maryland by the Object, which is a blog that is written by Tricia. Usually, occasionally there's a guest writer, but she writes most of them. Which is similar to the Curator's Choice, but it focuses more on how archaeological artifacts can provide a unique window into the past. And so these artifacts range from things that are really mundane to things that are really cool, and they encompass all 12,000 years of the state's history. But they provide a tangible way to explore the broader context of Maryland's past. So that's sort of my plug for all of our online resources. But I just wanted folks who weren't aware to know that these resources are out there. So now we're going to talk about our public archaeology program and then also start looking at some artifacts. So the Mac Lab's research department also runs our annual public archaeology program, which it's been running now for well over 20 years. And for almost 20 years, the focus of public archaeology has been at one site, the Smith St. Leonard site, which is an early to mid 18th century plantation site on the grounds of JPPM. The excavations have located a main house, most of which has eroded off the cliff there at Jeff Pat. So what's left of the foundation is only a very small part of the house. But there is a separate kitchen and laundry that were excavated, several slave quarters, a stable, a store, and other outbuildings. Archaeologists and volunteers have excavated almost 300 test units and screened thousands of buckets of dirt over the last 2 decades. And even though public archaeology had to be canceled this year because of the pandemic, curation staff, which is me and Alice Merkel, who's our lab assistant, we've continued to work on processing the artifacts from previous seasons. So I just want to show you some of the cool objects that we've recovered over the years. What you're looking at here, the 2 photos on the left, are the remains of a copper-alloy chafing dish that was recovered from a feature at the site. It would have been used by the Smith family to reheat food that had cooled, because the kitchen was separate from the main, dining area of the main house. So they would want to use something like this to have on the table to keep food warm. But it's the only one that, as far as I can tell, in our 9 million artifacts that we have at the Mac Lab, it's the only one in the collection, in the entire Mac Lab collection. We also, the archaeologists also recovered this iron and copper alloy corkscrew. Now the picture here on the right shows sort of an example of what one would have looked like. Obviously, the one from Smith St. Leonard is hinged, so this would have moved, which it doesn't move anymore because even though it's been conserved, it's still corroded in place. But that was pretty interesting, and we also found a copper alloy candle snuffer, what remains of a candle snuffer. This is a picture of it pre-treatment, before it went to conservation treatment to be cleaned up. And we also found some silver, or artifacts made from silver at the Smith St. Leonard site. The one here on the left is a silver thimble, and it's a little hard to see in the picture, but it has cupids flanking 2 hearts. And the first heart has the initial S engraved in it. So for this type of thimble, a young woman in colonial times would have she would have this thimble and have 2 hearts in it. And so the first heart was for her first initial, and she left the second heart empty until she got married. And then when she got married, she would put in the initial of her married name. And what's interesting about sort of intriguing about this thimble is that it only has the first letter, which means, for one reason or another, presumably the woman who owned this never got married, or died before she got married. And also genealogical research that's been done on the Smith family, there's only one woman that has the first name that starts with the letter S, and that's Susanna. And she sort of disappears and at the end of this, Trisha can correct me if I'm wrong, but I was trying to remember how the story went, but my understanding is that she sort of disappears from the genealogical record. That they know that she existed, but there's no record of her being married, and I'm not sure that there's a record of her death. But presumably this was her thimble, and so at the very least, she either never got married, died before she was able to get married, or she lost her thimble before she got married. But we have one other thimble similar to this from another collection at the Mac Lab, from a collection in PG County. But it was that I thought that was a pretty interesting story that I wanted to share. And so the other silver artifacts that we recovered was silver wrapped thread, and it's kind of hard to share at a PowerPoint presentation. So if you come and visit the lab, you can actually see it in person and under magnification, because the picture that you're seeing on the top, that is under magnification. So it really, when you look at this thread just like in your hand, it looks like little tiny roots. But the only way that it was recovered is that it was recovered from the kitchen cellar, and that the dirt from that feature, when they were excavating it, they water screened it through like window screen, so they could recover things like fish bone and beads and other small artifacts. And while they were going through that material, they were the archaeologists who were sorting through the material after it had dried. They started seeing this like little flickers, at first they thought they were roots, and then they were like, wait a second, there's something shiny here, and they actually brought it to our federal curator, and she knew exactly what it was. She said, this is silver wrapped thread, and let's put it under the microscope, and this is what it looks like. And so this sort of thread, the picture below it kind of gives you an idea of the type of garments and embroidery that it was used for. So it was like for like really fancy clothing. But this is one of the most unique artifacts that we have at the lab, because really, the only reason we have it was because of the sampling strategy they used for the kitchen cellar. If this would go just straight through a regular 1/4-inch screen. So when you are screening, you get a lot of artifacts when you screen with 1/4-inch screen, but you also lose a lot of small, little tiny artifacts. Archaeologists also recovered a small copper alloy sword hilt, which you can see here, that has not been conserved yet. And the object itself is copper alloy, so it's fairly stable, but we usually would send this to conservation just to get it cleaned up and get most of the dirt off of it. And then you'll see here sort of an example of what it would have looked like when it was intact. And then archaeologists also recovered the remains of an ivory hand fan, which you can see the picture on the top here is after it's been cleaned and conserved, and then a picture of it when it was in situ in the ground, and then an example of what it likely could have looked like when it was intact. So those are just a few of the groovy artifacts that we found at the Smith St. Leonard site. There's a lot more, so if you come and tour the lab in person, you can see a lot more. We have 2 cabinets full of artifacts just from this site and the Archaeological Range. So then we're going to move on to our next stop, which is the main conservation lab, the main conservation treatment lab. So the primary mission of the conservation program is to support the MAC Lab's research and curation programs by stabilizing the artifacts that are in the state's care. And so then the second mission is to provide conservation services as a revenue generating operation. So the conservators do work for outside clients, either other state or federal agencies, nonprofit institutions, archaeological consultants. We don't do work for individuals. That's really the only exception. And so this conservation lab was custom designed for archaeological conservation specifically, and conservators can treat artifacts of varying sizes and material, but we're really best known for our ability to handle large iron and wooden objects. The lab space was designed to be flexible, so different size tanks can be moved in and out, depending on what objects currently need treatment. There are several types of safety equipment, including overhead mobile vents or fume extractors, which are these sort of yellow and black trunks that you could see around the lab, as well as built-in fume hoods. Those are all to help keep the conservators safe when they're working with hazardous chemicals. And there's also, you can see part of it here is a 5-ton crane that runs along the top, the blue and yellow, that runs the whole length of the lab. So that assists with moving large objects such as cannon or large timbers, which the conservators have worked on many of those in the last 20 plus years since the lab has been open. So the lab also has one of the largest vacuum freeze dryers in the country. It's a freeze dryer is used for the treatment of waterlogged wood. It's got a chamber that's 12 feet long, so it can accommodate very large wooden objects. So that's why, we've gotten artifacts from all over the country to be conserved because we have the equipment to handle such large objects. So there's a couple of objects here. We have the remains of a dugout canoe, which was in several pieces. This is from the Eastern Shore. This was conserved several years ago at the lab, but it is now on display in Baltimore, in Fells Point, at the Frederick Douglass Isaac Myers Maritime Park. So those of you in the Baltimore area, if once COVID is over, if you've never been to that museum, I recommend it. It's got they're part of living classrooms, so they do a lot of outreach with students, but they do also have an exhibit space where we've loaned a lot of artifacts, as well as this canoe for display, for exhibit. And you'll also see here this object that's being placed into the freeze dryer. Believe this is part of a fire well pump that's from Alexandria, Virginia. We've done a lot of work for Alexandria Archaeology when they've recovered waterlogged timbers and things in particular. We've done a lot of work for them. So just to explain a little bit about the conservation of waterlogged wood, it's a twofold process that involves, you have to incorporate a material into the wood that will help consolidate and strengthen the wooden object, while the water is being removed from it. Because if you think of, say, like if you just let a sponge dry up on the edge of a sink, you see that it sort of warps and shrinks, and you don't want that to happen to a wooden object. So you've got to find a way to remove the water but still help retain the shape of the object. So at the lab, conservators soak waterlogged wood in polyethylene glycol, which we call PEG. And so the second part of the process is to remove any excess water by freeze drying. So that process, after it's been soaked in polyethylene glycol and it's placed in a vacuum freeze dryer, that process, it leaves behind the peg, which helps support the internal structure of the wood, but it then prevents any shrinkage or distortion. So that's sort of a quick and dirty, non-conservator way of describing how waterlogged wood is treated in our conservation lab. The Mac Lab also specializes in the treatment of iron objects. Many objects decay in the ground and become even more unstable when excavated, and this is particularly true for iron artifacts. So once an artifact is buried and it will initially react with the environment that it's buried in, but the decay slows sort of as the object reaches an equilibrium with the surrounding environment. But once the object is removed from the ground again, that equilibrium is disrupted and the object begins to react again. And so if left untreated, iron objects will just continue to deteriorate, and eventually you'll just end up with a bag of dust. And so usually one of the first steps in treating iron artifacts is to x-ray them. And the Mac Lab has this huge industrial x-ray, so we can get, it's one of the first steps. If I find, as I'm going through collections, if I find an artifact that's corroded, it looks like maybe it's something, I don't know, I'm lucky enough to have conservators down, sort of down the hall. I can walk it down the hall and ask them to x-ray it. So this is a really good example of an iron object. Doesn't look like much, right? It's sort of this flattish, curved iron object from a site in Harford County. But once we x-rayed it, we revealed that it was a highly decorated cast iron stove door. And so the x-ray then also helps, it can be used sort of a visual guide for the conservator, so they know now that there is something in that, that corroded piece of iron, so they can, as they're mechanically cleaning, they can kind of have an idea of what they're going to encounter as they remove those corrosion layers. And I'm going to give you before we move on to curation, I want to talk a little bit. I'm going to tell a cautionary tale of what not to do. This is, if you were on an in-person tour of the lab, I'd talk to you about this cannon because we have it, it's conserved, and it's out in the hallway in conservation, and we usually talk about it because it's a really good example of absolutely what not to do if you were to find a waterlogged iron object. So this cannon was found by a commercial excavator while rebuilding the waterfront in Fells Point in Baltimore. So I want to say maybe about 15 years ago. And prior to informing the state underwater archaeologists of the find, the cannon sustained substantial damage by amateur cleaning and then by it being allowed to partially dry out. So by the time the conservators from the Mac Lab were called to retrieve the cannon and bring it back to the Mac Lab for treatment, the surface was already beginning to spall off, and you can sort of see that in places here. It's a little bit harder here. All of this wrapping and all of this mesh, the conservators were just like trying desperately to save the surface of the cannon, but really to no avail. When iron objects absorb salts from the surrounding environments, they're either buried in or if they're in water. So when iron objects from wet saline environments are allowed to dry out without first properly removing those salts, it can cause irreparable damage to the object. The salts will crystallize as the object dries out, and it could quite literally pop the surface of an object off, which is what you're seeing here with this cannon. And initially, when it was initially, let me back up. When you look at this object, this picture here, you can still see most of the original surface is intact. You can see some places, this isn't long after it was taken out of the water. But despite what the conservator's best efforts, it just continued to deteriorate. And so this is what it looks like now. And now granted, it's a heavy, solid iron object, so you can still tell it's a cannon, right? But the surface is very pitted, and you can tell the original surface of the cannon is no longer there. So eventually the conservators just gave up on trying to save most of the original surface. But the problem is with the cannon, that meant losing most of its diagnostic information. But the conservators were able to save a small section that right here that had a fleur-de-lis and probably what was part of a serial number, because cannons have a lot of detailed diagnostic information on it. So because of the way this cannon was treated before it came to the Mac lab, we lost a lot of that information. But because there was a fleur-de-lis, archaeologists speculate that the cannon is French and that it likely dates to the War of 1812 because America relied heavily on French cannon in the war. But it's pretty small cannon, so it was probably mounted, on a small ship or a privateer for self-defense. So like I said, again, we just like to tell this story as an example of, like, if you find something like this, call a professional, call a conservator, call an archaeologist. So our third and last stop is the Mac Lab's Curation storage. And just sort of give you an overview so you can get a sense of the size. And I didn't pan up, but it's a two-story room. So once archaeologists have excavated and processed artifacts, and any artifacts that require stabilization and treatment are conserved, they're then turned over to curation for permanent storage, and they end up in this room. Prior to the Mac Lab being built in the 1990s, the state's collections were stored in substandard facilities where collections were in danger of loss and damage just from the unstable packaging material and poor environmental conditions, and just basic neglect. These conditions also made it difficult to know exactly what collections the state had, which made access for research and exhibit extremely difficult. So when the state collections were moved to the Mac Lab, the collections were finally provided environmentally controlled storage, which ensured long-term preservation. And the collection storage room was designed with compactable shelving, which essentially doubles the amount of usable storage space, and allowed for appropriate archival storage for a rapidly growing collection. And we're very close to being full, which I'll talk about at the end of this presentation, because we have a plan to expand the lab. It also provided plenty of open floor space for large oversized objects, as well as space for cabinets for the most significant and most accessed artifacts, as well as an area to store the associated records that go along with the collections, which without the records, the collections are really just a bunch of pretty objects or not pretty objects, because I think those of you who have done archaeology know that a lot of archaeological collections aren't like super pretty, right? They're not the things that people that you want to put on exhibit necessarily. The records are just as important, so we wanted to make sure that those got housed in archival materials and were taken care of as well. The move of the collections to the Mac Lab didn't just improve the storage environment, but it also did wonders for increasing collections accessibility. The Mac Lab provided the space and resources that allowed curation staff to bring the collections up to the most current curation standards. And so well-organized and archivally housed collections promote preservation and security, but they also make collections accessible for research, exhibit, and educational purposes. And that's really one of the primary missions of the lab, is not just preservation, but also to make the collections accessible. So before we leave curation, I'm just going to highlight some of the oversized objects. So if you were on an in-person tour, you'd come through this door and you'd get to walk around and look at all of these objects in person. So I'm just going to highlight a few of them. So many of the objects you actually see in this picture, like this large object back here and most on the shelving and these objects here, are all part of the Columbus steamship, which sank in the mouth of the Potomac River in 1850 after the boiler exploded and set the ship on fire. A portion of the wreck was discovered in the 1990s, and several pieces of the ship were raised and are curated at the Mac Lab. The Columbus was had side paddle wheels, and you can see that that's what this is here. It's one of the paddle wheel mechanisms. And this object here, along with the steel cradle, is about 18,000 pounds. And as I pointed out before, these are all parts of, this is part of the large piston and one of the main cylinders, and several other parts of the ship that I'm not an expert on the Columbus steamship, so a lot of the individual objects I can't necessarily identify for you. But this is the most impressive when you come into the lab, when you see this object right here. So this object is really one of my favorite objects too, even though it's a little stinky still, even after conservation. It was discovered in 1987 during the excavation of Brown's Wharf by archaeologists from the Baltimore Center for Urban Archaeology. So this wooden barrel was found. When it was found, it was filled with debris. It had a metal funnel. It had parts of a candlestick. It had a leather shoe, a spoon, rope, and a broken champagne bottle, which actually helped date the barrel to the mid-19th century. But most interestingly, though, it also contained 5 dozen fish, later identified as menhaden. Their scales and fins were preserved in this tar-like substance that also filled the barrel, and that's that tar-like substance. The barrel still smells like it, even after it's been pretty well cleaned. And so if you get close to it, you can still kind of smell that. And a lot of the other artifacts from that site, from Brown's Wharf, also have that same smell. Archaeologists think that the barrel was used for trash before being thrown overboard, and that the school of fish actually got caught in the barrel and died. Menhaden are considered a trash fish. They're used for fish meal, so it was unlikely that it was cured fish that was meant for human consumption. And this area of the harbor has obviously been filled in, or to expand the Baltimore waterfront. So when it was excavated on land. It wasn't an underwater excavation. The Mac Lab also curates the Baldfriar petroglyphs. These Native American petroglyphs were originally carved into these large island-sized boulders in the Susquehanna River, the largest of which was called Indian Rock. And it was between the Pennsylvania line and the Conowingo Dam. And in 1927, it was the Conowingo Dam is the reason we have these artifacts, because in 1927, the petroglyphs were removed because when they built the dam, this whole area was going to be inundated. So they figured, well, it's all going to be inundated and the petroglyphs will never be seen again. So instead, they decided to dynamite them all out of the rock and pick up the pieces. So they collected approximately 90 pieces that still had carved design on it. And they put the fragmented pieces, they tried to cement them back together, and then they were on display for several years at the Maryland Academy of Sciences, which is now the Baltimore Museum and Science Center in Baltimore Harbor. They eventually left there and they ended up in Druid Hill Park. And in 2005 is when those petroglyph pieces made their way back down to the Mac Lab for permanent curation. There are others that when the bulk of the petroglyphs went to Druid Hill Park, some of them at that point went to historical societies in Cecil and Harford counties. Those are still on display at those historical societies, except now that technically the state of Maryland owns all of these petroglyphs. We created loan agreements, but we want to keep them on public exhibit. So we've created loan agreements with those historical societies, and there's also petroglyphs. Some of these petroglyphs are also now on display at the Havre de Grace Maritime Museum and Susquehanna State Park. So if you want to see, other places that you can see them in person for those of you who live sort of in the northern part of the state. We also have a large collection of ordnance from Baltimore Harbor. So in 2004, during dredging of the channels to and from Baltimore Harbor, several ordnance were recovered. So the ordnance dating from the 20th century were destroyed by the Army Corps because they were unstable and hazardous. And there were also some earlier shells too that they didn't feel they could safely defuse, so they destroyed those. But most of the ordnance relating to the Civil War and the War of 1812 were retained, conserved, and are now curated at the Mac Lab. And there's also several, at least a dozen, that we loaned back to Fort McHenry because most of this ordnance was either shot at or shot from Fort McHenry. But we wanted to make sure some of it went on public exhibit, so we've loaned a number to them. And the last object I'm going to talk about that's in collection storage is this wooden dog shore from the Stephen Stewart Shipyard, which is was located on the West River in Anne Arundel County. And it's one of the best documented and preserved shipyards in Maryland. A dog shore, for those of you who don't know, I didn't know until this object came to the lab, which this one here is fashioned from a branching tree trunk, is one of two blocks which support either side of a ship on the launching ways while it's being built. And during the launching process, the dog shore is the last timber to be removed. So this is a pretty substantial timber that was used. And it's interesting because they used the natural branching of a tree to create it. It's not two timbers, sort of nailed together. And what's particularly interesting to me about this dog shore is it actually took 17 years to conserve. It spent 1 year so pretty much as soon as the Mac Lab opened, it came to us in the late 1990s, and it spent a year in solutions to remove staining, and then it spent 3 years in PEG, soaking in PEG. But I'm not sure if you can tell by the picture, but its shape would not allow it to be placed in our freeze dryer for freeze drying. So if this could have been put in the freeze dryer, it probably would have taken several months to finish, to complete the conservation. But instead, because rightfully so, the conservators didn't want to cut it in half so it would fit in the freeze dryer. You can essentially put an object through the same process as a freeze dryer by just placing it in a freezer. So this sat in the Mac Lab's walk-in freezer for 13 years before our head conservator, Nicole Dabb, felt that it had finished its treatment. So it took 17 years, but just a few years ago now, it was removed from the freezer and it's now on display in our curation storage. So that wraps up the sort of virtual tour of the inside of the lab. But before I completely wrap up my talk, I just want to talk about a couple of projects that are happening to the actual building. After 20 plus years, almost 25 years, or 25 years since construction started on the Mac Lab, since construction started in 1996. After 25 years, the Mac Lab really needed a facelift. Paint was peeling, windowsills were rotting, the foundation was leaking, the roof was leaking. So over the last year, we've had the whole building is getting new insulation and siding, foundation is being sealed and waterproofed, a new roof is being installed, and it was really kind of serendipitous that this project coincided with COVID. I mean, there's not really anything good about COVID, but or the pandemic, but the lab, some staff has been allowed to work in the lab, but there's only like 4 or 5 of us at a time, and we're not open to the public. And if this was all this work that's being done on the lab right now is all happening during normal times. It would be really difficult to have tours, and like the front doors, you can't get in the front doors and things right now. So it's like one small good thing about the pandemic and the Mac Lab being closed to the public is that this work can all be done without us having to negotiate, trying to get tours and researchers and things into the public. No, excuse me, into the lab. And the final thing is I want to mention is that there's going to be a future expansion and renovation of it, after the work on the outside of the lab. We're going to be doing an expansion and a renovation of collection storage as well as other parts of the lab. We have room for maybe a year or two more of receiving new collections before our compactable shelving is full. So we've just this spring are starting the design phase to put two-story addition on the west side of storage here. And this kind of gives you an idea of sort of the plan view. There's also going to be a new record storage room. One of the conservation labs is going to be changed into one of a room just for record storage. So we'll have more room in collection storage just for artifacts. So we'll have additional compactable shelving that will be included not just in the addition, which will have compactable shelving as well as space for oversized objects, but there'll be new extra additional compactable shelving placed in the existing storage. Our study cabinets will be placed on compactable carriages. And just trying to think if there's anything else. Oh, right. And our field processing room is going to be expanded because we have a fairly small field processing room now. So when we have volunteers come in to help us wash artifacts and process artifacts, there's not a lot of space, and sometimes we have to kind of move out into the hall with extra tables and things. So these two rooms here are going to be expanded to make a larger field processing room. So the only other thing then, the implication is if we're going to renovate all of the space, it means all the collections have to be moved out. So the next year and a half of my life is going to be preparing for that move to completely empty collection storage, so all this renovation can take place. So that pretty much ends my presentation and the tour. Like I said, I hope when the pandemic is over, you'll visit the lab in person. There's so much more to see and learn, and depending on who gives you a tour, whether you get a conservator or an archaeologist or a curator to give you a tour, you get a slightly different tour. You could come to the Mac Lab over and over again and see something different every time. And it also depends on, in conservation, you never know what they're going to be working on. Like I said, they conserve artifacts from all over the country. So at any given time, you just never know. So I hope that you will take the opportunity to come and visit us when we're back open to the public. We offer tours every Thursday, which are usually docent-led tours, and then the first Friday of every month we have staff-led tours. And then we also, I hope you would consider volunteering with our public archaeology program when we're able to get that back up and running again. And as well as, depending on what other projects, other Mac Lab staff, may be open to volunteers depending on what projects are in the works. So in the meantime, check out the Jeff Pat website, and we also have a Facebook and Instagram page. So I'll be happy to answer any questions. It's kind of a lot to go over in sort of a short period of time, but let me unshare my screen.
Thank you, Becky. That was wonderful.
Thank you. I'm just trying to figure out how to stop sharing. I know it should be easy, but
yeah,
it's...
It should just say stop share at the bottom.
Oh, I see it.
Yeah.
That yes, I see it.
Okay. Thanks. We have a couple of questions. First of all, thank you. Everybody is giving you a big thumbs up for that presentation, and everybody, I think we all can't wait to go down there and visit. And Ilka wants to know if there's anybody can go down there and do research.
Yeah, we're not, you don't have to be quote unquote a professional archaeologist. But generally, if somebody wants to access collections for research, it does need to, you do need to sort of have a research question. You need to kind of know what either types of artifacts, what sites you want to look at. Every once in a while I'll get somebody who's like, I don't know, I just want to come and look at stuff. And I'm like, well, you can come and look at stuff if you want a tour but it's helpful from a curator's perspective to sort of help narrow down the types of artifacts to pull, and the collections that you want to access. But yes, we don't, there are some institutions that are really strict about collections access, and the Mac Lab is not that. We have, ever since we first opened with the first director, Julie King, and then following with Patricia Sanford, that we really focus on like getting the collections accessible. And for me, I feel like my job is relevant if people use the collections. If there's, yes, you want to preserve them for the future, but like you can't, there's preservation shouldn't be just for preservation's sake. It should be for getting it, making it available for research and exhibit and education. So yeah. So in theory, yes, anybody can come, but we do like to have sort of a directed, idea of what types of collections you want to look at.
Right. Well, that's cool. And Jessica wanted to know, could you tell us more about how you create controlled environments for different material types?
Well, ideally, the only material types that we really have specialized environments for, we create specialized environments for, are metal. In theory, we want the Mac Lab in general, collection storage to have good climate control. And we have struggled, even though, it was worse before we moved into the Mac Lab, but the Mac Lab still, almost any museum or curation facility you go to, struggles with environmental control. We shoot for high 60s in terms of temperature, and then relative humidity like in the high 40s, low 50s. But the main, more importantly, you don't want the swings in relative humidity. You want to try to keep it as stable as possible. And we've struggled with that over the years at the Mac Lab, but now with some of the renovations that are going to be done, that's going to help with that. So we shoot first to just have the overall environment as stable as possible. But for the sensitive artifacts, which metal in particular really does not obviously respond well to higher humidity, so that's fairly easy to create what we call microenvironments with. We use silica gel, which is just a desiccant, and we create a couple of different ways. Sometimes we just use like Rubbermaid type, like food storage containers. Those are really good for metal objects that we want to keep in a lower humidity, but we want to be able to get easy access to them. For objects that are probably not going to get accessed very often, we have a system where we just do like a triple bag 4mm Ziploc bags, which are the size bags that we use for our artifacts. If you do a triple bag, no aeration, you get as much air out as possible, and you triple bag it with silica gel, that can last for years where it doesn't need to get opened. And even if the desiccant sort of starts to absorb humidity, so it may not be quite as dry in those microenvironments as when you initially created them, they still create a buffer a sort of a buffer that if the environment around those microenvironments are the humidity goes up, it doesn't go up as fast within those those microenvironments. So it's not like you have to worry about having that silica gel fully desiccated all the time. That's just not possible. We have like 9 million artifacts at the Mac Lab, so it's not possible to constantly be checking on all of these microenvironments. But those are really the only sort of specialized environments that we create at the Mac Lab, and it's for metal primarily.
Any other questions for Becky this evening as we wrap up? It is such a pleasure to have you this evening with us, Becky. And, I think it's amazing that we have such a phenomenal resource and facility in our state. It must be unique. I don't think that every state has a facility like that in the United States. So again, that's pretty special to have down in such near to us that we can go and access and learn from. And I can't wait to get down there and get my hands on some of those things and touch them and feel them and smell that fish bucket. I want to smell it.
Yeah, it smells like tar. It's really quite awful. I can't imagine what it must have been. I mean, it probably didn't smell like fish anymore because the tar smell was so overpowering. But must have been quite a surprise when they started excavating that barrel. So.
And so, thank you everybody for joining us. Oh, Ilka, come on.
Yeah, just a quick question. Do you take collections from just about anybody in the state of Maryland?
Well, our primary mission is to accept professionally excavated collections. However, we do and have accepted like private collections from people who these are mostly collections from like the folks who collected, in like the mid 20th century, mostly, or a little bit later. Like for example, like I said, I saw Nancy Giese here. Her husband Spencer. We have at least 3 groups of his collections because he collected so much over the years, and we accepted all of his collections. So yes, we do. I mean, we generally, consider. We have a collections committee that makes those sorts of decisions. Depending on what the collection is, we ask sort of questions of like, do we know where it's from? Do we have site, is there site-specific information, or does it contain artifacts that, are unique that we don't have in our type collections or can be used for exhibitor education? So we do consider those types of collections, definitely. So it's just not a guaranteed. It's not guaranteed that we would accept them necessarily, because there's the professionally excavated collections that are from what we call like Section 106 archaeology. The archaeology that's required by law. Those are the first collections that we're required to take, and then anything beyond that is just a decision that we make. It includes, the committee includes archaeologists from the Maryland Historical Trust as well as the Mac Lab, because we're part of MHT. So we all kind of get together and make decisions about that. So.
Ilka, any last words for the group, and we'll see everybody at the next meeting.
Yes, thank you very much, Becky. That was really fascinating.
Good. I'm glad you liked it. I'm glad you reached out. It's sort of been weird. It's like it is a lot. It's a lot more fun, quite honestly, to give a tour in person. Because you can really interact with people, and people can ask questions along the way. So I'm glad that you all like this, because it's sort of hard when you're just giving a PowerPoint on virtually to kind of tell if people are enjoying it. So
it is hard, but everybody enjoyed it, and we're happy that you are a resource that we can tap into as we move forward with our archaeology club and the work that we're doing over here near Baltimore.
Yeah, well, you have Jason and Lisa, so they're talk about a fabulous resource. You guys are real lucky to have them.
Yes, we are.
Yeah, they're fabulous. I love them.
And we'll see everybody soon. We have look for your emails. If you are in the club, you are eligible for the Facebook group. So join the Facebook group for the Archaeology Club. Stay tuned, and we'll see you at some of our upcoming programs. And everybody stay safe.
All right. Thanks again.
Yeah, we'll see you later.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.